In this video, we'll be looking at how to replace the steering knuckle of the Baja Board S2. To start with, make your life easier, turn the board upside down. The first step is to take the wheels off. Next, you want to loosen the bottom screw of the steering knuckle to basically loosen the bottom suspension arm. Now just be careful here, because with the screw on the bottom suspension arm, you have your screw itself and you have a spacer here. Now sometimes the spacer can be loose. You don't want to lose that spacer. You always need to keep a spacer between the rod end and the steering knuckle. Next, we loosen the screw connecting the steering link to the knuckle. To take note, between the rod end and the steering knuckle, there are two washers, spring washers. They may look like nothing, but they make a big difference to the turning, so make sure you don't lose those. Take them off and put them somewhere safe. Next, we'll remove the bolt that's holding the top side, now the board is upside down, holding the top side of the steering knuckle to the top suspension arm. Okay, keep the bolt somewhere safe. You also see that there are two washers, tapered washers, conical washers, big side out, small side in. Make sure you save those two. Sometimes the bolt itself might be a bit stuck, because you've used the board for a while, there's a bit of dirt inside. Just get a plier, give it a bit of a spin. It comes out, those two drops out, keep them safe. And now you have the entire knuckle drive shaft assembly almost loose. Next, we are going to try to remove the entire drive shaft assembly away from the board. So the only thing that's holding on to the board right now is basically this zip tie that's holding the boot on. So you cut that. Zip ties are cheap. You can buy them on Amazon, I'm sure, or in any local hardware store for next to nothing. So don't be afraid to cut those. And now you can pull the entire assembly out. Just make sure don't get your hands dirty on the grease on the outdrive side of things, and you'll be fine. I usually put the boot up so it sort of contains the grease and keeps it out of my hands. Next, in order to separate the drive shaft from the steering knuckle, you will see we have to get the pentagon off the drive shaft so we can pull the shaft through. So there's always there's a locking pin here. Now in some cases the pin can be quite loose, it's a sliding fit. In some cases, if you've used the board for a while, it might be a bit of grit, it might have bent a bit, it might be actually stuck in there. Now if the pin is a bit stuck in there, you want to hammer it out. I shouldn't say hammer, you don't have to try too hard, but just knock it out, I suppose. Find yourself we're using a vise at the moment, but find yourself a bit of a holder with a gap. We will use a M5 screw. You can use a slightly smaller than 5mm, any kind of pin or shaft. And just gently tap this out. Now, the pin is out. So now the actual pin is out. You can slide this off. Sometimes Again, the pentagon can be a bit stuck on the shaft. So if that was the case, just grab hold of the whole thing, let the drive shaft loose, just gently tap it with a plier until it comes off. That's off. That's off. So now we have fully separated the steering knuckle and the drive shaft. Let's say your bearings inside, as in this case, the bearings are broken, so you are going to have to change out the bearings. Before you start removing the bearings, get the new ones and put them in the freezer. Now this is not 100% essential, but just to make sure, hopefully this will shrink a tiny bit. We're talking, very, very minuscule, and that'll make the actual fit later on a bit easier. Get yourself a solid surface, because you're going to need to do some hammering. You will start by removing the inner bearing right here, because this way you can position it in this fashion and you can use a pin of sorts to knock it out. Then you can do this. If you start with this and you put it this way, then the bearing itself isn't going to go anywhere. So we start by heating up the surface. Once it's heated up, obviously be careful of your hands. I would be using instead of oven mittens, but in this case, we're going to use a towel. Just turn this baby upside down. We're using an 8mm pin of sorts. We'll position this inside the hole of the outer bearing and use it to tap away on the inner, gently tap away on the inner face. As you can see, the bearing is out. Now, obviously, if you're replacing the bearings themselves, the bearing is probably broken already, so you don't have to be too careful with it. So if it does have a bit of dent here and there, you're going to throw this away, so it doesn't matter too much. So now comes time for the outer bearing. We are going to heat it up like before. About 15-20 seconds. Now we're using a vise. You can get 2 blocks of wood or something similar that you can position it on either face. So you obviously don't want to interfere with you don't want to position any of these surfaces across the bearing face. So you want to make sure it's at the edge. We've got a spark plug socket that fits nicely into the hole of the bearing here. And we're going to use that to just gently, there we go. So to put the bearings back in, you know, there's no particular order which way you have to do. We're going to do the back way. Well, we may as well do the front, do this way first. Position on top. And you do want to try to do it, obviously, within safety, handling, practicality. You want to do it when the aluminium piece is still fairly hot after you heat it up. Obviously, for the reason that the aluminium is expanding, so the hole is a bit bigger and it's going to be a bit easier to slide this thing through. So you want to use a cylinder. We're using the spark plug thing again. That's approximately the size of the outer ring of the bearing. That way you can distribute the force evenly. You don't want to have, you know, just a single point and you start smashing it down on one point. That way all the stress is going to concentrate here. You might actually break the bearing during installation. So we're going to use a ring. Do it here. And just gently work our way around the edges. And you might get a nice little lucky tap here. Okay. So now that's in, and you want to make sure everything is flush. In this case it is. So we do the same thing with the inside face. And in this case it actually just slides right in because the actual metal aluminium piece of the knuckle is quite hot. And it's expanded, so it just goes right in. Now we just leave this to cool in the corner for about 10 to 15 minutes. To reassemble, it's pretty basic. You're reversing the previous processes. Shove this through. You put the pentagon back on. Now with the pentagon, one side will be completely flat and one side you'll have a tiny little ring or lip. You want to make sure the side with the ring goes in towards the knuckle. Right, so the side with the ring goes in here, and with the pin, you push it back in. In this case, the pin gone in pretty easily. Sometimes you might have to knock it with a bit of a plier or a hammer, mallet. So now you've got the knuckle and steering assembly back together again. So now we're going to put this back on. So just bear in mind which direction it goes to. Steering link is out here, so you want those 3 holes to be facing out, and obviously that's got to go in here. So step number 1, you can actually just position it this way, just leave it there. You put your sex bolt back in first. Remember that we had 2 of these tapered washers. You put 1 tapered washer on, fat side out, skinny side or the small side in. Thread it through the rod end of the upright. And before you do that, you put the other one as possible, and there we go. That's gone in. Now we can secure it by putting this screw back into the thread here. Before you do it, obviously put some Loctite. We're using strong Loctite, and you don't need much more than just a dab, a droplet, and tighten by hand. Then with an Allen key, and then you use your spanner to properly tighten. There we go. Shove this into the out drive. The great thing is the out drive. I'll recommend putting the steering link back on as a number 1. Always remember a bit of Loctite on the tip. 2 washers, spring washers, M6 spring washers between the rod end and the knuckle. And remember which hole you went in before you took it off. Or if you don't remember, just look at the other side. So in this case, we're on this hole. There are 3 holes you can see on the steering knuckle. Now bear in mind this board is upside down, so that is the top hole really, that's the bottom hole. So the higher you go, the less steering you will have. The lower you go, the more steering you will have. So in our case, in most boards, at the rear of the board, we typically put it onto the top hole. So you have a twitchy back. And at the front of the board, we typically put it on the bottom hole. So you have a better steering at the front and less at the back. Bit of Loctite there. If you've taken off the tapered washer, just remember to put it back on. That's it. And the last bit is to re-secure the new boot. There we go. Now that this is all reassembled, pentagon recess back onto the pentagon here. Wheel back on, got your wheel nut, a dab of Loctite, and simply there you have it. I hope that was clear enough. If you've got any more questions, our contact details will be below in the description.